So, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Unpacking Possibility. I'm your host, Traci Stein, as always. So happy to be here with you. So, tonight I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to read you two news items that are, I think, relevant. And then I'm going to get into the kind of heart of what I wanted to talk about tonight. And that is something you may or may not have heard of, and it's called quantum jumping. There's so many things that have the word quantum in front of them. I want to be thoughtful about that it can be overused. But the tool I'll talk about tonight and the person who coined the phrase, really, it's all about tapping into something that represents your best self, whatever that is for you, and using it to do better and hopefully feel better and live better in the now. And really, that's what this whole podcast is about. So I'll go over the two news items really quickly, just something, some things that I came across that I thought were interesting and relevant, and then we'll get to the heart of the show. So I still call it Twitter, but it is X. And I pretty much honestly just use that for kind of up to the minute news and commentary. And, some of it's good and some of it isn't. But I saw a really interesting post by a researcher I'm not familiar with. Her name is Nerosha. I hope I pronounce this right, Nerosha Murugan. And she said that her lab had just had a paper come out, and the title of the paper is Exploring Ultra-Weak Photon Emissions as Optical Markers of Brain Activity. Exploring ultra-weak photon emissions as optical markers of brain activity. So, in plain language, basically what they're talking about is that the brain emits light, and that this light changes depending on the activity of the brain. And I'm going to tie that into something a little metaphysical because I have to do that. But I'm going to read you her description from her tweet. And I actually am going to post the link in the show notes if you want to read the article for yourself. But what she said basically is the human brain emits light, faint, spontaneous photons arising from metabolic and electrical processes. These light emissions not only pass through the skull, but also reflect changes in cognitive state, pointing to a new biophysical layer where light may carry information. And their distinct spectral and entropic signatures suggest light may serve as a label-free, non-invasive marker of brain function. So, this is not my area of expertise by any means, but what I found so intriguing about the tweet is that, what she's essentially saying is their lab found that, again, the human brain emits light, not gigantic amounts of light, but faint, spontaneous photons, she's saying, and they're arising from the metabolic processes, the electrical processes that our brain undergoes when we're doing different things, thinking different things or engaging in different cognitive tasks and so forth. Right? So as what our brains are doing changes, the amount of light emitted changes. I thought it was intriguing that she said the light passes through the skull. And at some point, it might tell us more about what's going on in the brain without doing something invasive, if the light can be measured outside of the brain. And, this made me think about the idea of auras. It's not that unusual for people to be able to see the aura. Most often, people describe auras or energy fields or light that they perceive around someone else as being around the head, or around the head and about around the shoulders, sometimes around the whole body. But that is something that most people and most scientists would poo-poo and say that's ridiculous, or, that's just one of those woo-woo things, but maybe it isn't. I think when intuitives see the energy or see light around the person, I think there is an intuitive understanding a lot of times of what it means. Full disclosure, I've seen light and light patterns around people's heads and shoulders on and off ever since I can remember. Sometimes I don't see them well, sometimes I do. And it's easier to see against a plain white background. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see that I have a relatively unattractive white background tonight, and I normally don't do that, but it's just basically two sound treatment curtains that I pulled closed, and maybe you can see my energy field. I don't know, but being against a plain white or a plain black background can make it easier to see the field. And ever since I was young, as I just mentioned, sometimes I would see sparks of light, like very punctuated, bright, but very fleeting, again, like sparks of light around somebody's head. And sometimes it was if they had a lot of strong emotion going on. I don't actually know what it means when I see the sparks, and it's not, I'm not moving my head unusually. I haven't hit my head or anything like that. It's not, I don't know what it is, and I'm admitting that. But a lot of other times I'll notice this kind of white haziness around, mostly around somebody's head and shoulders. I notice with my animals that when something is changing in their bodies, and I've noticed there's around people as well, and I've talked about that elsewhere, but if somebody's energy field is, if there's something going on inside of them that seems, I'm going to say discordant or not in sync with how they would, it would be if they were feeling good, I tend to see the energy field and it tends to look very particulate to me. And I'll notice that even if someone is next to someone who doesn't have that. So again, I'm not saying it's, I don't know what it is, but a tangent from there, when my cat Sebastian, a few months ago, my cat Sebastian passed away very suddenly. He got very sick. We had to take him to the vet, and then we took him to the emergency vet, and we had to help him leave his little cat body. And, it was traumatic for us. But for about a week or two before, I would notice that his energy field looked very particulate and very noticeable. And our other cats did not have that look. And I mentioned it to my husband, who, of course, didn't want to hear this. And I understand why. But I've noticed that even like when my grandmother was older and, before we knew she was ill, her energy field looked different to me. So anyway, all this is just to say, I think a lot of times people see some sort of energy around others, and maybe it's the light that's being emitted. I don't know. But I'm curious to hear what you think about that. It's just such an interesting phenomenon to me. And maybe as time goes on, we'll learn more. And maybe there's a perfectly, scientifically understandable reason why many people do see what we would describe as an aura. So anyway, that was one of the news articles. I thought it was worth sharing. The other one is completely different, but it's related to two different podcast episodes on this podcast, and actually an interview I did on our other podcast, which is, again, Curious Explorers, which I do with Kathy Kelly. But the article relates to psychedelics, and in psychedelics from mushrooms. So psilocybin is probably the most well-known of those. And somebody named Paul Stamets posted a link to a CBS News article. Now, Paul Stamets, for some of you, I know if you're more into medicinal mushrooms, I don't even mean psychotropic or psychedelic effects. I just mean some mushrooms, some of you may know, have been shown to have anti-tumor activity, antibiotic activity, and so forth. So there's a lot of value in a lot of different varieties of mushrooms. Again, not my area of expertise, but it's something you could look into if you're interested. Paul Stamets is really a pioneer in talking about various types of mushrooms and the health benefits they have and so forth. But he posted a link to the CBS News article. And the article said, Colorado regulators are issuing licenses for providing psychedelic mushrooms and are planning to authorize the state's first, quote, healing centers where the mushrooms can be ingested under supervision in late spring or early summer of this year. Pretty interesting, right? So one of the interviews I did a while back was with Dr. Anthony P. Bossis, otherwise known as Tony Bossis. He's a friend and a colleague, and he's also a faculty member at NYU Bellevue. Tony's terrific, and he's got a TED Talk out as well talking about their research with psychedelics, or psilocybin specifically, and how these were largely beneficial in helping people who were dealing with a terminal illness or very serious illness. And they knew that they would be confronting their own mortality, some of them sooner rather than later. What they found, to summarize Tony and his colleagues' findings, is that one dose supervised, there was plenty of prep and, counseling beforehand. And this was done in the hospital setting. But these patients each received one dose under controlled conditions and of psilocybin, the psychedelic compound from a mushroom. And what they noticed is that largely these people reported really beneficial effects. They largely lost their fear of dying, right? Think of how profound that is. They found they had greater forgiveness for themselves and others. They lost a lot of the distress related to having, again, a very serious or terminal illness. I don't think we can understate the importance of that type of finding, right? Mortality is one of those things that waits for all of us, but none of us is really well conditioned, really, at least not in American society, to deal with thinking about our own mortality. It's not something people like to talk about. It's very taboo. It's even tough for a lot of therapists to talk about it or broach the subject with ill patients. And I understand why. Again, we're not socialized to be adept at talking about a lot of difficult things. But back to the CBS News article about the psychedelic mushrooms being available in Colorado soon. They were saying basically this is happening about 2 years since Oregon began also offering access to psychedelics. The mushrooms are a Schedule I drug, and they're illegal currently under federal law, except for in clinical research. But more than a dozen cities nationwide have deprioritized or decriminalized them in the past 5 years. So basically, let's see what happens in Oregon and in Colorado. But this ties also into a very recent episode, which was my interview with Marty Stalker, who's an award-winning director, but he's also a veteran and, did 2 tours of duty and really was struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health issues that responded somewhat to conventional treatments and psychotherapy, but not enough. And he was really in a rough place for years. He wound up finding out about the use of various natural medicines and psychedelics among them from other veterans and has been using them since. He's, some of this he's done to learn as a filmmaker what this is all about. So I don't think it's my role to tell other people what they should do with their physical health. I think you should consult with your healthcare team, whatever that is for you. But I think these news items are interesting and intriguing and potentially maybe useful. Maybe now, maybe down the road, maybe for you, maybe for someone you know. So I'll post the link to the CBS News article in the show notes as well. So now let's get to Burt Goldman and quantum jumping. I'm going to do my best to explain it simply, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Burt's life. And the reason for this is because I think what Burt talked about and taught, whether you think it is exactly what Burt thought it is, or whether you think it's a purely psychological phenomenon, either way, I'm going to tell you right now up front, it doesn't matter. I don't think it matters. Because either way, you are enlisting a part of yourself that is even more competent, even more confident, even more skilled than you may feel in this moment or in general, right? And I think anything that can help us do that, that is low to no risk, I would say it's worth checking out. That's my opinion. So Burt Goldman was someone who had been interested in, different philosophies. He had studied with Paramhansa Yogananda, the subject of Autobiography of a Yogi. He had worked with and collaborated with Jose Silva. And if that name sounds familiar, Jose Silva founded Silva Mind Control. But the idea of, Silva mind control. And again, I'm going to put it in my own kind of phrasing, but it is to live a better life, to expand and tap into potential that we normally don't think is accessible to us through various visualization, meditative, and philosophical approaches. So, Burt Goldman, I think his story is so interesting because, I've watched a ton of Burt Goldman videos. I have taken the Mind Valley, Burt Goldman, quantum jumping workshop, and there are certain, meditations I go back to more frequently than others. I have read a little bit about his life story, but he sounds like a person, or my impression of him has been of someone who is innately curious, open minded, and optimistic. And I know that we're not all wired that way, either because of life circumstances or just who we are. We're not all equally optimistic, curious, and open minded. But all of us can become more of all of those things. And I think sometimes to use the power of the mind to change our lives for the better, we have to at least be willing to give that a try. And again, I'm not saying it's equally easy for everybody, but Burt Goldman is somebody who, even in his 80s, was constantly creating positive change for himself, constantly stretching himself, but doing so in a way that actually made it seem very easy and fun and would satisfy a curious person's desire to learn and to understand things that most of us don't even think about. So Burt talked about parallel lives, parallel universe selves. And that's where the quantum part comes in, because there's a theory that there are many versions of the universe, not just the one we're in. There are many versions of ourselves. And again, I know for some people it's going to be like, well, yeah. And other people will be like, well, that doesn't make any sense, But I know that, even in many popular movies, the idea of, someone meeting another version of themselves that is maybe looks pretty similar, but is different in some very important and significant ways. I don't think that's based on nothing. So Burt Goldman in his 80s developed this technique, again, largely a meditative technique with hypnotic a hypnotic induction, or a way to get you into a deeper, more receptive state where the movie in your mind becomes more vivid and the rest of the world kind of moves off to the side for a little bit, right? And many things in our lives are hypnotic. Many creative pursuits, athletic pursuits, dance, and so forth. But we can train ourselves to be more deliberate in the way we induce that state. And he would refer to the alpha brainwave state, commonly associated with feeling more creative, with daydreaming. And what he wanted people to do is embrace that, step into that daydreamy realm where really all things are possible. And before anybody says, well, that's not productive, I just want to say we're daydreaming all the time. And for a lot of us, when we're depressed or when we're anxious, or if we're just, when we're conditioned to look for the worst, we're daydreaming that stuff too. And we are training our bodies and minds to expect the worst. And by the way, our bodies will respond to those daydreams almost as if whatever we're daydreaming is really happening to us. That's why you notice, your body tends to feel better when you're daydreaming of, I don't know, somebody you just went out on a date with and you really enjoyed, and where this could go, right? Or the vacation you're going to go on. That induces a very different state than, oh my God, I have this presentation at work, I'm going to completely bomb, right? So Burt, with quantum jumping, is teaching techniques to get you into that daydreamy, receptive state. But what he believed is that in that state is where you could access another version of yourself that could help you to cultivate a talent or lose a fear or even heal something in your current self, in your current lifetime, in your present. So, he said there were an infinite number of universes. He's not the only person to say that, by the way. Stephen Hawking and Einstein had considered that was possible. But Burt said basically there's an infinite number of universes encompassing all possibilities, all points in time, and all possible selves. And he said whatever can be imagined is. And what he meant by that is that, in theory, you could be, in one of your other lives, the conductor of an orchestra. You could be a classical musician. In another life, you could be a talented chef. In another life, you might be somebody who is struggling or is homeless. In another life, you might be a great athlete. In another life, you might be a professional singer or whatever, or a physician, anything you can imagine. There may be some version of you that is actually having that life. Some version of you in some other life may be partnered and have children. Some version of you in another life maybe does not have children. Maybe some version has 10 children and some version has one child. I don't know. But what he said is basically there's infinite possibilities. Now, why is that useful for quantum jumping? I'll tell you. Because Burt used this technique and taught other people to use it as well to create in this current life the skills, to access the skills or hone the skills or the emotional state, or even in, financial abundance. And I know please know I'm not trying to say it's just so easy, you just go do this, everything's fine. I'm not trying to minimize what anybody's dealing with right now, but I just want to offer a tool that I find intriguing. And I'm going to tell you examples from Burt's life just to kind of illustrate what he meant. So Burt believed that we had twin selves, he called them doppelgangers, that were just like him, but maybe looked largely like him, maybe even had the same parents, maybe not, but they made different choices. They had developed different talents. They moved through life differently, and their lives turned out differently. And so, as an example, Burt said that at one night he was at a dinner party in New Jersey. I don't know if the New Jersey party is even that relevant to most of the rest of the story, but that's where he was. And somehow after dinner, everyone wound up singing, right? I wasn't there, but maybe I could imagine, if there's a piano or whatever, people would get up and sing. And he could not sing. He had never sung. He wasn't a shower singer. He wasn't somebody who's like, oh, I always wanted to sing, and if I were only brave, I could do it. He was somebody who did not sing. And he figured it was a good time to try an experiment. He wasn't even super invested in becoming a singer at that time. But what Burt did, and by the way, he did this on the spot, just quietly in his own mind doing this, and this is something that you will, with practice, be able to do as well, believe it or not. But he got into his meditative state, and I'll tell you after the break exactly the procedure he used. But he wound up getting into a meditative state and visualized Al Jolson singing. And while Al was singing, and in Burt Goldman's mind, Burt walked into his body, right? He mentally walked into Al Jolson's body, and while Al was singing, Burt sang with him, right? So this is now a very vivid kind of daydream, but it has an impact. And when the time came to sing, for Burt to sing, he blew everyone away. And what's even more interesting is that he became such a good singer that he was offered paying gigs, right? He was offered jobs to sing professionally. Now, you can actually go online and Google Burt Goldman singing, And I've seen one of the recordings of him singing at some event, and he had a beautiful voice. And listen, I know some people are probably like, well, he probably always had a beautiful voice and, he just felt confident or inspired enough to sing. Let me just say that that alone would be pretty wonderful and, enough to make me use this technique. But there's more. Burt is in his 80s and he's using quantum jumping to find the version of him that can do various things. So everything from becoming a writer, he wound up writing, I think, 11 books, and they sold. Not that easy a feat to accomplish. He wanted to become a photographer, but he actually wasn't any good. And he decided to go into the space and quantum jump into the lifetime where he was a skilled photographer, a successful professional photographer. And he asked that photographer version of himself for advice. And the advice many times didn't make sense, but he trusted enough to follow it. So the story of the photographer quantum jumping thing is that when he met his photographer self, that self told him, when he said, how am I going to become a great photographer? That quantum jumping parallel universe self just said, take a lot of pictures, which obviously sounded like useless advice to Burt at the time. And of course it did. But he decided to trust this and he said, okay, fine. And then he went out one day, took a bunch of pictures. And you know what? They were terrible. But there's more. So Burt went back and he did another kind of, again, meditative session, getting into this space where he could, in his mind, jump into this other reality and ask the photographer, like, hey, I need more advice. And the photographer, Burt, just said, plant yourself. And if you go online, you can hear Burt telling the story better than I am. But again, plant yourself didn't make any sense. And I'm sure Burt was a little bit frustrated at this point. But he forgot about it for the time being. And then the next day, he decided to go to a marina in San Diego and take a bunch of photographs. I believe this was at a time when he used a camera and used old school film. So he went out onto the rocks, out into the water so that he could take better photos of, I guess, the boats and things in the marina. And, the rocks were wet and slippery. And he realized, he heard, I think, in his mind, plant yourself, which was the advice of the photographer in that alternate kind of universe. So he planted his feet so he wouldn't slip, and he made a kind of tripod out of his body and his legs. And he said he took a bunch of pictures, like similar but not the same shots of this site, kind of panning his body to the extent he could, photographing up a little, down a little bit, to the right a little bit, to the left, diagonally, and so forth. You get the idea. And he took about 130 photos. And then when he developed the photos, he laid them all out, and they made a larger picture altogether. And he came up with this technique where he would make collages out of all of these similar photographs. So out of these hundreds of photographs or whatever, these photo collages wound up selling for thousands of dollars. Burt's photography was showcased in a variety of galleries. He was a successful professional photographer. Now remember, he's also become a successful professional singer and a successful professional author. And he attributed this to having gone into these, I'm going to say inner spaces, found a parallel universe self, who already knew how to do these things well, getting the advice, coming back and following it. He became a pianist, even though he couldn't read music, right? And at age 78, he became a painter. Again, was not an artist before, and his paintings sold. And more important, I think, than any of this is that these inner explorations brought him quite a lot of joy. And he wasn't somebody who was like, well, I'm in my 70s or I'm in my 80s. I can't do this. It's too late. How often do we tell ourselves that? I mean, I think I was probably even 25 telling myself, oh, it's late to do this or learn that or whatever. But think of how many things we want to do are a matter of mindset. And again, if we're able to access a highly skilled parallel universe version of ourselves that can provide us with helpful information to feel better now, that's amazing and wonderful. And it's worth giving it a try, I think. But even if we were to say this is simply a mental technique that allows us to tap into a part of our current life self that really is just waiting to be expressed, that is more talented or more confident or more competent than we realize. That in and of itself would be amazing and wonderful and worthwhile. We have to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll hear more about Burt Goldman, quantum jumping, and the actual technique Burt used that you can use too to try quantum jumping for yourself. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. So, as I was saying, there's a lot about what Burt Goldman was talking about that helped him tremendously. And he really wanted other people to benefit from this as well. So, again, as I was saying, I don't personally think it matters whether this is some mystical experience Burt was having or that you or I will have, or if it's allowing ourselves to get out of our own way and tap into talents and skills and confidence and optimism and curiosity that we might normally kind of shut the door on because, we're human. So, just a little bit more. Again, Burt was talking about getting in an alpha brainwave state. And as I mentioned earlier tonight, um, there are simple techniques to help us get into a more receptive, creative, imaginative, daydreamy state that is conducive to meditations like quantum jumping, but just in general. So again, the procedure is simple for quantum jumping. This is, Bert's got free stuff all over YouTube and so forth, and you can buy his book. I'm not sharing anything that isn't readily available. What I would say is if you're driving while listening to this podcast, please hit pause. Do this when you have time to really relax and kind of settle in and take in the procedure for getting into this more deeply meditative state. It's not super deep, but because Burt uses some hypnotic techniques, certainly it's better if you just kind of relax. I'm going to describe this. I'm not really going to lead you through this so much as outline it, but it's certainly something that you can follow on your own. And you might even want to kind of slow it down or look at the transcript of this episode. Read the instructions in your own voice with pacing that feels right to you and give it a try. So, the first thing I would say is set an intention. Have a clear sense of what it is you would like to get better at or learn. And then imagine, just, vaguely even the version of you that would be able to do this thing well or know what you'd like to know and so forth, right? So, again, to use the bird example, if you wanted to be a painter and you're not a painter and you've never painted, imagine, I guess, that the parallel universe you that you'd like to connect with is the one who's a really successful and skilled painter, right? So you can trust the process. The other thing I want to say is if you don't feel like you see or notice anything in the beginning, don't worry. This is really a process of allowing rather than forcing, as with all meditations, I think. But basically, set the intention. Think of the gifts and talents and wisdom and experience that you would like to acquire more of. And then Bert would have people get into a relaxed space. I would say give yourself an hour to relax, even if you're only doing this for 10 or 12 minutes. His meditations were pretty brief, but he would start you with a simple technique to get into the alpha state. It's really just counting back. He would have you count back from 3 to 2 to 1, but he would have you say each number 3 times on the out breath. So I'm going to model this for you. He would say, all right, now we'll start with the 3 to 1 count. And he would say on the out breath for each number, repeat it 3 times. So 3, 3, 3, and then 2, 2, 2, and then 1, 1, 1. Now, if you're highly hypnotically suggestible, that might be enough to make you feel a little bit trancy. And if you're not, it might just help you to focus on the numbers and relax a bit. When I focus on the numbers, I actually see them in my mind. And what's interesting is that every single time I've done this, each of the 3 numbers is a different color, and they're always those same colors, even if I haven't done this for months. It's just an aside. But you'll do the 3, 3, 3, 2, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1 countdown, and then breathe. Sometimes Bert would go more into the visualization of journeying to that parallel universe self. Sometimes he would use another deepening technique, another simple hypnotic technique, and that would be to count down from 10 to 1. Sometimes he would use a device where he would have you visualize taking numbers out of a bin or a box next to you and placing them on a velvet curtain one at a time, and then removing them, and from 10 all the way down to 1. And again, this is just to symbolize to your subconscious mind that you're going deeper, you're going within. Now you're focused really more on the imagery being described. By then you would be in a more receptive state. And he would always have you move to a hallway, and again, in your mind. So to envision a hallway, and then notice that at the end of the hallway is a door. And he would have you experience it however you experienced it. So the door might look the same to you every time. It might be different, but it's just your mind's way of symbolizing going into another parallel life. And so he'd have you walk down the hallway, and at the end of the hallway is the door, and he would let you know that when you open the door, you'll be on the threshold of that other parallel universe, and that you can walk or jump. That's where the quantum jumping came from where you are now into that parallel universe. And once you did so, you would see that version of you that again has the skills and talents and the wisdom and the confidence and so forth that you want to have more of in this life. And at first he'd have you just kind of notice that self and, maybe notice how they're dressed, or, where you find them, who are their friends, what is their life generally like, how do they feel when they're doing that activity or whatever that you want to learn to do well. And then after you've acquainted yourself with the space and observed them, you would ask them a question like, how could I get better at whatever it is, playing the violin or painting and so forth, or performing at a sport. And then he would just say, be receptive and listen to what they have to say. Now remember, he got some advice that made no sense to him. So just notice. Obviously, you're going to only trust advice that doesn't violate any, particular, values or morals that you have. That's not what we're talking about. You're going to trust that you're going to get good advice, that even if it's not entirely clear at the time, it's something that seems like something you could reasonably try out. And, you get the advice you need, you thank that version of you, and then you turn around and you walk back to the door to the present moment, the present you, the life you know now, and you jump back, walk or jump back over the threshold. I'm going to say shut the door behind you. and bring yourself into the present, re-alerting by counting up. You could count up from 1 to 10 and give yourself the suggestions to be very grounded in your body. And again, there's so many videos on YouTube, free videos. You could see Burt Goldman leading these exercises yourself. Now, I just want to say as my disclaimer, for some people, when they start to relax, they may notice that they feel more anxious, right? If this is you and it doesn't feel tolerable, just stop doing the meditation. Not everything is for everybody. Or if you're in therapy, maybe you do the meditation with your therapist, right? That's never a bad idea. But if you have done the meditation, write down what you noticed. That's always important. I always say that even if it doesn't make sense, that's okay. Don't worry about it. I want you to think of yourself as pretty much an observer for the most part in these exercises. Just see how you feel. And again, I recommend doing this usually like the end of the day maybe, or when you have some quiet time. You don't need to rush out the door and go somewhere. But what you might find is that the more you do this exercise, the more vivid it will become, like most meditations, I think, most imagery. Burt would also say, you can step into the self that that you meet once you get to know them and feel comfortable and it's familiar. If that person is singing and you want to sing as well as they do, you could do what Burt did with Al Jolson. But it's really up to you. But again, it's just another mental technique that if it feels wonderful and helpful and powerful for you, terrific. If it is not a fit for you or it doesn't feel like a fit, just don't do it. There are so many other ones that you could try out there. But I really do enjoy bringing you things that I find interesting and that I think could be helpful. So let me know what you think. If you like the episode, please do remember to like, share, follow, tell a friend, leave me a comment, let me know what you think. I hope this has been helpful. And as always, I wish you all the very best. And until next time, be well.